All right, all you positive heads. On this week's SoulShare episode, I'm very excited to have Rick Doblin back with me on the show for the first time since 2015 in episode 13. We just passed episode 2013, by the way, so it's been a minute. Rick is doing incredible work in the world. He received his doctorate from Harvard and went on to become a trailblazer in psychedelic research way back in 1986 when he founded the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, aka MAPS. Super excited to have you back here, Rick. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Well, I'm so glad to be back and to hear of all the progress you've made since episode number 13. Incredible.
It's been a minute. You know, the listener base has definitely grown dramatically since then, and it's just really cool to have someone who is willing to support so early on. I mean,
Yeah.
episode 13, you're OG, but that's kind of how Rick rolls, right?
Exactly. I like to be in near the beginning of things, even when they're small.
Yeah, obviously. Well, I'm gonna start you off with my cliche opening question. I probably didn't have this in the mix at the time, so the last time you were on, but it is this. You're in an elevator. The woman next to you looks over, says, "What's your passion?" You have 10 floors to answer. What do you say?
Psychedelics and the spiritual, mystical experience of connection and the political implications of that experience. And also the political implications of healing people's trauma, anxiety, depression, fear-based things. So mainstreaming psychedelics.
I love that. I love that.
And then I would ask this woman next to me, like, what is your experience with psychedelics?
Exactly. It really, I mean, even in the years since you and I have spoke, which I can hardly believe it's been 8 years, how much development has happened. So I'm really excited to kind of catch up and hear what your experience has been in those 8 years since we spoke. And before we kind of dive in there, what I would like to do, like I said, a lot bigger listener base these days, probably not everyone's went all the way back to episode 13. So if you would share whatever is relevant to share about your backstory to kind of set the stage for this conversation.
Okay. Well, let's go all the way back 51 years, talk about a backstory, to 1972. And I was 18 years old. I was a college student in my very first year at a college called New College in Sarasota, Florida. It was a private school when I went to it. And that's where I started doing psychedelics. And that's where I started realizing that my bar mitzvah had been a major disappointment. but taking psychedelics felt like that's what my bar mitzvah should have been.
Right.
Who am I? Where do I fit in? All of that. And but I had a fair amount of difficult experiences letting go. I wasn't emotionally mature. I wasn't really supported in a sense by a therapist. I was doing these with my friends or myself. And so I went to the guidance counselor at college and I said, help me with my trips. And again, this was a school that had all-night parties fueled by psychedelics till the sunrise. The campus police said their job was to protect us from the real police. And it was a nudist colony at the swimming pool, at the outdoor swimming pool. So I was a shy boy and I was just like, oh my God, this is like... And it was academic freedom. The idea is the student's curiosity was the most important thing. Wow. There's no grades, all written evaluations. And all these years later, I'll just say that this school is now being destroyed by DeSantis because it had to merge with the state of Florida system. So he said it's the most woke example of a college in Florida. So he's killing it. And he's... bringing in sports teams and fraternities and sororities and kicking out the gay people and not giving tenure. In any case, though, I go to this guidance counselor and he takes me seriously. And I was also a draft resistor, thought I would serve my country by going to jail rather than run away to Canada or pretend I had bone spurs or anything like that.
Wow.
And so I had turned 18 and I was sort of waiting for something to happen from the police because I had a passport. I had a driver's license. I had a social security number. I was paying taxes. I should have been known to the government. But in any case, the guidance counselor gave me this book to read, and it was phenomenal. And that's really the start of everything. This book was by Stanislav Grof, an MD, PhD at Johns Hopkins, world's expert in the psychedelic LSD research in particular. And the research was being shut down after the backlash from Nixon in 1970.
Right.
And Stan's book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research, was just an eye-opener for me.
Yeah.
And the amazing part was that my guidance counselor had gotten the manuscript copy directly from Stan. So afterwards, I wrote Stan a letter, and he wrote me back, and I did a workshop with him. And so I felt for a bunch of different reasons that I would devote my life to psychedelics. I had been disturbed, is the way to underplay it, really, by stories of the Holocaust. As I was growing up, I was a young boy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, now thinking the whole world would go blow up. And then I was my own country doing some counterproductive and deadly things that I objected to in Vietnam.
Right.
And it just made me realize more and more psychological factors of how we differentiate ourselves from others, how we associate with tribes, us and them, in group, out group. And what Stan was writing about was this realms of the human unconscious, but some part is sort of biographical, another part is related to sort of the human experience of birth. And then the other part is more spiritual, mystical experiences, transpersonal, he called them, where you feel connected. And this was happening at the same time that we were sending people to the moon. And a lot of the astronauts were saying some of the same things. You see the Earth as a whole. This was the time of the whole Earth catalog. And it was a new consciousness, actually, of how we're all really interconnected.
Right.
And so this was science, though, not religion, looking at all these things. And then it had the reality check of therapy. Can you use these experiences to actually help people in their struggles to be more fully alive, or not to be depressed or prolonged grief, anything like that? And so the fact that it was suppressed, the fact that I wasn't sure I could have a normal job. My parents said, you're going to be a felon for being a draft resistor, which they were okay with, but they were like, you'll never have a normal job. And so all of that came together in the sense that, okay, I'll study psychedelics. That's a hope for peace. And I can be an underground psychedelic therapist that doesn't require a license. That'll be my career. And that was 51 years ago. And since then, I dropped out of school for 10 years to get grounded. I built houses, always knowing I would go back to school. So I went back to school at age 28 and started as a college freshman. In 82, my very first semester back is when I learned about MDMA. And I learned about MDMA when it was both a drug called Atom as a therapy drug, but also it started becoming sold as ecstasy as a party drug.
Right.
And so it was clearly doomed, because this was during Nancy Reagan, Just Say No, and Reagan's escalation of the drug
This
war.
is your brain on drugs with the egg frying in the pan.
Exactly. And so it was clear that there was this brief period of time for advocates of psychedelics to get involved and try to develop a strategy to deal with an eventual lawsuit from the DEA, or an effort by the DEA that we could try to stop with a lawsuit. So I did that. We basically, I got going to Esalen and meeting all these advocates for psychedelics. At the time, there weren't that many of them.
Small circle.
It was a very small circle. So I got to know Albert Hoffman, who invented LSD, Anna Sasha Shulgin, Stan Grof. It was just Terrence and Dennis McKenna, Andy Weil. It was amazing. And so we did have this opportunity to share MDMA with people who would later become witnesses, because it was legal. So we didn't have to worry about people exposing themselves for having done something illegal. So in 84, the DEA moves to criminalize MDMA. I wait till about the 30th day of the 30-day public comment period, go to DC, file for a hearing. We got the hearing. We're winning the hearing in the court of public opinion and in the court. DEA freaks out. At 85, they criminalize MDMA. We later won the hearing. DEA rejected the recommendations. I sued him a couple times. in the appeals court, won twice. Finally, the DEA figured it out
Wow.
and prevailed on the third time. But 86, I started MAPS to go through as a nonprofit psychedelic pharmaceutical company to go through the FDA with MDMA primarily. 87, I graduated college, tried to get into a clinical psych PhD program to learn how to do psychotherapy outcome research, but nobody will let me in, even though I had really good scores and recommendations and all of that. And so I was just confused, like here since 1972, when I decided to focus on psychedelics. Now it was 1987 and 88, and nobody's letting me in.
Wow.
And so I realized I didn't know what to do. So often when I'm stuck, I'll smoke pot and think about it. So I thought about it and I realized I want too much too soon. I want to do the science, but the politics in the way. So therefore I should study the politics. And I had heard about this guy who had been part of a debate in Harper's Magazine about drug policy. And he was from the school that I'd never heard of called the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. But he had mentioned the lawsuit that we had against the DEA. And I called him up and I said, I need a mentor. Would you be willing to be my mentor if I can get into the Kennedy School? And he said, sure. This was Mark Kleiman. And I managed to get in. And I did get both my master's and PhD from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And learned my dissertation was on the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics and marijuana. So over time, MAPS has grown. In 2014, we started the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, our for-profit pharmaceutical arm. And now we've got 110 or so people in the Benefit Corp. We've got about 35 people in the nonprofit. We've got 2 successful phase 3 studies, very successful phase 3 studies. And we are in the process of preparing an application to the FDA for what's called a new drug application. So that's briefly my story. 51 years since I decided to focus my life on psychedelics. And practically every day I just think how lucky I am that now that I'm 69 and almost 70, that an idea that I had when I was 18 still makes sense to me.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
That it is really an incredible journey that you've been on. And it's like so many great stories, you know, it's you against the world in the early days with this vision. And then here we are decades later, and how many people, I mean, MAPS has, you know, spread so far and wide. It's done so much good in the world. So many think of the number of advocates you have today versus people in your corner 50 years ago. Like, wow, what a journey.
Well, it's amazing too, because now people recognize me on the street sometimes, and I'm like, wow, you know, and our psychedelic science conference that we just had last month, about a month
in Colorado
ago, in Denver at the Colorado Convention Center. It shocked us. We were so amazed. There was 12,400 people at this conference. And what was so exciting was the message of it. Everybody was so thrilled to be there. We had around 10 concurrent tracks, almost 500 speakers. But from my perspective, again, from a political perspective, it's been extremely important to go out of our way to try to build bipartisan support for what we're doing. And there's been a lot of strategy behind that, a lot of it working with veterans. But the conference itself, after a couple opening talks by some of our staff, land acknowledgement, some of our staff and myself, then Governor Rick Perry, the former governor from Texas, who was in Trump's cabinet, Secretary of Energy, gave an opening talk, and he was followed by Governor Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado. So we had a sitting governor and a former governor, Democrat and Republican. And then we had the director, Josh Gordon, of the National Institute of Mental Health. So it was just incredible. And, you know, all told, it was just an inspirational experience for all of us.
Yeah. Everyone, I have multiple friends who were there, and that seemed to be the takeaway for everyone. Like, huge somewhat surprised of how robust this thing turned out to be, and the energy and support, and you know, I guess pun intended, everyone's really riding high coming off of this event. And, you know, for me, I didn't make it to the event. However, I happened to be at my parents' house when it was going on one day. And from time to time, they'll have Fox News on, which other than wanting some entertainment value, I typically will kind of tune out. And as I'm walking through the living room, I hear them talking about the conference and having, like, not just mentioning it, like a segment on it. And, you know, now let's bring two opposing sides of this conversation on to, you know, which, you know, of course I stopped and watched the whole thing, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like a big segment on Fox News. You guys have done something, you know, like really, really incredible.
Yeah. I'm curious what it did for your parents. If you could say, how did it influence them?
Great question. So, you know, me being me and always a little bit off the beaten path of what I was raised to sort of, you know, I was raised in very conservative Christian household. I've never seen my mother drunk. I've never seen either of my parents drunk. I've never hardly heard them cuss, like, you know, very as like straight laced as can be. And, you know, a few years back, my father started dealing with depression for the first time. I was like, Dad, let's, you know, let me show you some of the research that Rick and the world has, you know, put together over the years. And I just kind of, you know, they knew I was an advocate for a long, long time. You know, early days, it's like, what? You would take something and alter your brain, you know? And, you know, so finally get up to the point where I get my dad to take some psilocybin and ketamine and MDA, and it helped. And he's been microdosing. And I mean, this is a man who, like, you know, up until COVID, who's 76, and up until COVID, door knocked every Sunday to invite, or every Saturday to invite people to church on Sunday, you know, to his very conservative, you know, straight laced Christian, you know, world. And yeah, I mean, it's had a really positive effect. And I've heard stories like this from other people. And with the, you know, it seems like Pandora's box. I mean, if they're open to it and seeing the benefits now, anyone can be. From my perspective.
Now, what about your mom, though? So you said your dad is seeing the benefits.
Yep,
does your mom understand as well, or?
I'm working on getting her to try, at least starting with microdosing. She has not done it yet, but she is basically kind of giving me the indicator that she will. And there's like some fear there. She's like, I don't want to mess with my brain, you know? And it's like, Mom, like psilocybin as an example, it's regenerative. This is like, you know, there's a lot of things you do that have a left and right foot, you know? Mushrooms is like one of the things, you tell me, I haven't heard of anything other than a upside. You know, obviously if someone takes it in the wrong, if they have psychosis or in the wrong setting or something like that, it could be a negative effect. But as far as physical, you know, what it does to your biology, it's like, this is regenerative to your brain. So in body and mind and soul. And, you know, so I think I'll get her to at least start. I want to try with a microdose. Okay, let's double that microdose. Okay, let's triple that microdose. You know, that's my aim, but I'll report back on that one. Haven't quite gotten through to her. But my father, I'll share, I gave him 3 grams of psilocybin. He didn't feel anything. He's so stubborn and in his, like, I think, fear modality that it just, you know, it didn't really, I mean, maybe he felt something and just played it cool, you know, but he's like, oh, I don't really feel, I don't know, what do you know? And I mean, ketamine worked, MDA worked, but the psilocybin, I didn't really do much, shockingly.
Wow. Is that the one that you started with, the psilocybin?
You know, what did I start with? I think I might have started with ketamine, and then psilocybin. And I think I did first time ketamine and then some MDA, an hour or so in. And then I think the next time was with the psilocybin. And he just kind of, like, you know, I think I did a small dose, didn't feel much. I gave him like 1 gram, then 3 grams. So I think we'll try again. I want to try with LSD as well. I think maybe that'll give a similar but different effect.
Yeah. Does your mom see the growth that has happened in him if he's less
Absolutely.
depressed?
My mother is an advocate at this point. Like, she will make the claim that this is a good thing. And her grandson, who has Asperger's, I've got him to try psilocybin for the first time. It's so funny to think about her advocating for that. Like, when I was his age, oh my gosh, you need to, like, call the police or something if I did this. And so yeah, he claims he's had a burning in his head of his whole life, like and it whenever he's taken psilocybin, it'll go away for a few days. He's
Wow.
done it a few
Wow.
times now. Yeah.
Wow.
um,
Well, here's I guess a deeper, different but bigger question in a way. So what I'm concerned about is, um, people who have these kind of very conservative religious views, whether they be Christian or Jewish or Muslim,
mhm.
more, you could say, in the direction of fundamentalist, literal kind of
Mm.
belief systems. How do they see those things again, after they have psychedelic experiences? What has
Right.
it done for his spirituality? And I'll just add one thing, which is that, the backlash that happened in the 60s, psychedelics were connected with Timothy Leary and the counterculture and the
Yep.
anti-Vietnam War protests. And so then Nixon sort of squashed it. So that was kind of for counterculture political reasons. Then the next backlash happened late 70s, early 80s, again with Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan, but that was the parents groups. That was like fears of, parents about their kids and all of that, and just say no. Now, if there's going to be a backlash, which I don't see likely to happen actually, but if there is going to be one, the worry is that it might come from fundamentalists who, may have these experience or may fear stories about how people have experiences that they see things more as
It's the devil.
metaphorical rather than
Yeah.
literal. Yeah. So how has this impacted your father in particular, in terms of his view of religion, spirituality, church, all of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. you know there's so much fear baked in with him around God. God is like Dad was, my grandfather. If you don't get it right, he's gonna hurt you. And there's rules, and you better do it right. And I'm prone to violence, kind of thing. And
Wow.
so I think that was what he was embedded in him, you know as a young boy. And so there's a lot of fear around um, spirituality, and that's what's caused his diligent. I mean, the guy has been like Sunday, read the Bible all day every day since I was 12 years old almost. And it's only in the last couple of years where all of a sudden he kind of went into this kind of weird depression state, and isn't reading as much, doesn't feel worthy. Like, it's kind of like, I'm
Mm.
not worthy of God, or whatever. And it's sort of like very odd behavior, honestly, compared to what he was like, all the
Mhm.
many years before. So when he's actually taken, my hope is like he would really have a profound spiritual experience that helped him to
Mhm.
expand the blinders, because he certainly heard me talking about my ideas around consciousness, the ultimate nature of reality, spirituality. Very
Mhm.
I'm pretty loud about it. And he is thick. He is thick. It seems to have helped him. He looks at it more like, oh well, yeah, it made me feel a little better. I could sleep better. It's like almost like looking at it and only thinking of it from a physical standpoint. Like I said, we didn't have a big breakthrough with the psilocybin like I expected. So he's still. It's not like it's really shifted his spiritual belief as much as I'd hoped. Although I don't feel like we've had that really breakthrough experience yet either. SAS is, or MDA is like, it's great and it's feel good, and he seems happy and bubbly and jokey in that with that. And ketamine a little different. It's more like he went into the meditative sort of like, I got a
Mhm.
few like wows out of him, like this is, the little fear crept in at times with him. But Other than that, no treatment. You think of a ayahuasca experience, or
Yeah,
or LSD or psilocybin work can be that. This just changed my worldview.
yeah.
We haven't gotten there yet, but I'm hopeful. I'm gonna, I've been thinking here. It's been a while since we did that. Maybe almost a year ago, or 8 months, 9 months ago, probably the last psilocybin attempt. So I want to really try something again. I was kind of thinking maybe I'd try LSD this time.
Hmm.
I don't know if you have recommendations, but
Yeah. Well, let me ask another question. So when you say MDA, are you
Mhm.
sure it's MDA, not MDMA? And
Well,
sassafras.
it's
Sometimes sassafras can mean MDMA or MDA.
oh
People
really?
use it in both ways. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, um, but that is my understanding. Is SAS is always MDA. I didn't know it could be both, so I'll
Well,
have to check with. I have a friend that actually kind of puts it together in this incredible tincture with like rose quartz and Damiana, and it's very intentional, and
yeah.
she's very much a medicine woman herself. So I'll have to inquire about that, because no, I'm not
Okay.
100%
Well,
sure.
okay, because MDA is a little bit more psychedelic, more visual than MDMA.
Right.
So, did you see that, or did your dad report that kind of thing? Um,
Not really. It's almost like he's a little bit in denial around it all too. He's so stubborn, and it's like he's not going to give too much weight or credit to these things. Yet, if I were to go and offer him some of this little tincture today, he'd be like, "Oh, okay, well, I'll try it." He likes
wow,
it.
wow, 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 wow.
As my
That's
brother
neat.
will say, we go, "Dad likes his sassy juice."
That's
So,
hilarious.
yeah.
Well, I do think that there are, for people that are reluctant like that to sort of let go
Hmm.
and experience it. I'm not sure quite how you did it before, but there is a way where you give the sassafras, the MDA, or the MDMA first, and then LSD either at the same time or a little bit later. So they have this sort of
Open heart
reassuring
already.
fear reduction, open heart, and then it's easier to open up to
Yeah.
the more dissolving, ego dissolving psychedelic experience.
Yeah, yeah, makes total sense. Yeah, I have personally found that is a great combination
Hmm.
myself. Using MDMA or MDA. But yeah, now you got me curious. I'm gonna have to, like I said, in my understanding, sassafras is always MDA, so I did not realize it could be both.
Well, it's just the names that people use. So
Yeah.
yeah, but let's assume for now it was MDA. So he has a little bit more of an experience of a bit more psychedelic. So if he's open to it, I personally prefer LSD over psilocybin.
Yeah, me
Um,
too.
it does last longer though,
Yep.
and so your dad would have to be ready for that.
Yep. Right. Yep. Yep.
And then also, I think sometimes you don't need so large, overwhelming kind of an experience for people that are reluctant. That's where you talk about the microdosing, and then the medium dosing, and then eventually the macrodosing.
Yep.
But it's great that he has the depression stayed away.
It's definitely better. It's definitely better. And so,
Wow.
the first time I gave him anything, he was in a pretty dark place, and it really, my mother was just shocked by like how much he lit up, and he was his old personality during an hour after taking this, the sass, um, and he's actually, then I gave him some ketamine, and he slept for the first time really well that night in many months. And so, yeah,
Wow.
it was really a positive thing overall.
Great. That is great. I mean, that's one of the best reasons to have kids, is they bring you new stuff
Right.
that you might not
Right.
have been exposed to yourself.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So you had mentioned earlier that you have some new drug applications. Can you speak to that? I'm curious about that.
Yeah. So, what an NDA, new drug application, what that is relates to the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and that's where you apply in what's called a new drug application for permission to have something become a prescription medicine.
Mm.
And in order to do that, you need much research. And
Right.
you first need what are called preclinical studies. Those are basically studies in animals about toxicity and a little bit about mechanism of action. Then you move into what are called phase 1 studies. So actually 1985, before MAPS, in the nonprofit before MAPS, I had 28-day toxicity studies with MDMA done in the dog and the rat. Then you have these phase 1 studies. From 86, when I started MAPS, to 92, we had 5 different protocols rejected from Harvard, from UC San Francisco. But then the group at FDA that regulates psychedelics changed in 1990. And then finally in 1992, they gave permission for what's called a phase 1 study, this dose response safety study with MDMA, with Dr. Charles Grobe that we worked with at Harbor UCLA. That went through much of the 90s. Then we started what are called phase 2 studies. Those are where you start working with your patient population, and you want to do what are called pilot studies, small exploratory studies, where you're trying to figure out what's your dose, what's your treatment, what are your outcome measures, how do you do double-blind studies. You explore all different things. That took us 16 years. And so it was studies in the US, Israel, Canada, and Switzerland. So basically from 1986, when I started MAPS in April 8th, to November 29th, 2016, so 30 and a half years, we had what's called the end of phase 2 meeting. And that's where you argue with the FDA that you have enough data, you should get permission to go to phase 3. And phase 3 are the
Right.
large scale randomized placebo-controlled double-blind studies that you need to prove safety and efficacy. So we've done those. And the first one that we published was 2021, May 10th, in Nature Medicine. And the journal Science declared it to be the most, one of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of the year in the entire world.
Wow. Wow.
It was phenomenal. The results were great, highly statistically significant, 0.0001, 1 in 10,000 chance it was random. We worked with severe PTSD patients, PTSD an average of over 14 years, but 1/3 had PTSD over 20 years. They had tried either therapy or medication, in most cases both, so what they would be called treatment resistant. The results were phenomenal at the 2-month follow-up, and this is after 3 MDMA experiences, 1 month apart, and 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 3 for preparation for the first MDMA experience and 3 after each one. And this is all compared to controls that get the same therapy but don't get any MDMA. What we showed is that 2/3 of the people at the 2-month follow-up, 2 months after the last experimental session, no longer qualified for a diagnosis of PTSD. It was just phenomenal. And of the remaining 1/3, 21%, or 2/3 of the 1/3, had what's called clinically significant reductions of PTSD symptoms, even though they still had a diagnosis of PTSD. But over time, they might lose that. So 88% responders, 12% non-responders, and we had nobody tried to kill themselves. We did enroll people who previously attempted suicide because we felt that we had to work with the hardest cases. And so the results were phenomenal. In fact, they were so good that we met the criteria for getting approval on the basis of 1 phase 3 study instead of 2. So we applied to the FDA for that, and they said no, that they wanted us to do a safety study, a second phase 3 study, not so much to prove efficacy, but for safety. So we have now finished that, and it's being reviewed by a journal. We hope to publish it in the next couple months. And we're getting the data ready in the next couple months to submit to the FDA for this new drug application. The FDA has 6 months. MDMA has been declared a breakthrough therapy. We have an agreement letter and what's called the special protocol assessment process. So FDA has already pre-negotiated with us the design of the studies and what information they need. So there's a 6-month review process, but the clock stops when FDA asks questions. So in any case, we're hoping by middle of next year, 2024, if all goes well, we're hoping to have FDA approval as a prescription medicine. But it's not going to be MDMA. It's MDMA-assisted therapy. it's the therapy that is the key thing. The
Oh,
MDMA helps the therapy be more effective so that it will be approved only under direct supervision of therapists. It will not be a take-home drug. Ketamine is sometimes in Spravato in a spray form or lozenge form. Sometimes it's made into a take-home medicine.
right.
MDMA will not be like that. It will
Huh.
be only administered under direct supervision of therapists and only by a limited set of therapists that have been through training in what has been used, the therapeutic method used in the phase 3 studies. So that's what we think should be the case. So it's going to be a different form of FDA regulations to make sure that this is what happens. And we're totally supportive of that. In fact, the FDA has never approved psychedelic assisted therapy. So they're relying on MAPS and the MAPS Public Benefit Corp to tell them what we think is the way that it should be regulated as a medicine. That's a lot of what my dissertation was on. So we're the reason I think Science in 2021 said that we were one of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of the world is both because our study was phenomenally successful and it's the first ever phase 3 study with psychedelics, but also because we're the leading edge of this whole psychedelic renaissance. There are studies coming with psilocybin for depression, for treatment-resistant depression, major depressive disorder. There's all sorts of research coming on now with 5-MeO-DMT, with ketamine, with ibogaine, with ayahuasca. So I think the science sort of recognized that this award was both to us, but it was in a sense really to the field of psychedelic-assisted
Right.
therapy. And
Right.
so I think we're at this cultural transmission point or transition point where roughly it's been roughly 60 years since sort of psychedelics really came onto the scene in the early 60s. Leary and Ramdas and Ralph Metzer were at Harvard from 1960 to 63 when Leary and Ramdas got kicked out. So we're basically 60 years since the controversy began over psychedelics.
Right.
And then everything shut down near the end of the 60s. And not only that, 1970, we shut down research all over the world. The U.S. was terrific at exporting a repressive drug policy that also was one of the most egregious examples of infringement of scientific freedom in the history of science,
Wow.
such that all this research basically disappeared, and people that got psychiatrists got educated, in 1980s and 90s, they didn't even hear a word about psychedelics, even though it was the most important thing being studied in the 50s and 60s. The whole idea of neurotransmitters was in large part discovered because of LSD, because LSD operates in millionths of a gram. When people talk about microdosing, it'll be like 10 micrograms, 10 millionths of a gram. And so people were starting to think, how is it that these incredibly tiny amounts of something have such a massive effect? Well, there must be chemical messengers like that in the brain that this is mimicking. So serotonin was identified in large part because of the early experiences with LSD. So now that we are all these years later, our society has adjusted. So when psychedelics came out during the 60s, that was a difficult time in a lot of ways. That people didn't talk about death hardly at all. If you had cancer, it was a death sentence. People didn't even talk about it. The first hospice in the United States wasn't until 1974, where people would be sort of taking care of palliative care while they were dying. The first birthing centers, women were tranquilized, men were banned from the delivery room back then. If you did yoga, it was a weird thing, and people didn't do yoga. It was somehow connected with a foreign religion. If people remember the Beatles, when they brought Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the inventor supposedly of transcendental meditation, these weird guys in robes, and so meditation was not accepted. It was really strange, and so now we have about over 5,000 or 6,000 hospice centers. We have birthing centers all over the place. meditation is everywhere. Mindfulness is now commonly accepted, taught at the YMCA. So is
Right.
yoga. You look at movies and things, lots and lots of psychedelic imagery and movies and advertisements. So basically, as a culture, we have integrated everything except for the psychedelics.
Yeah.
And that's where we're at right now, is the mainstreaming of psychedelics and psychedelic medicine, psychedelic experiences, and also psychedelic drug policy reform. So one of the reasons that we chose to have the big Psychedelic Science 2023 conference in Denver was that Colorado passed a bill just this last November legalizing natural plant medicines and providing for state guides and programs. Oregon did that for psilocybin. There's other states that are considering having something similar on the ballot in 2024. There's a lot. Denver was the first city to make mushrooms the lowest enforcement priority. It's kind of funny. I'm sitting here in a town called Belmont, right outside of Boston, and we're next to Cambridge. And Cambridge is very, very progressive. They jokingly call it the People's Republic of Cambridge. But Somerville is a town that's next to both Cambridge and Belmont. But Somerville, a bunch of months ago, decriminalized, legalized plant medicines.
Wow.
And the people in Cambridge were so embarrassed that they weren't the first. that within weeks,
that's a good thing.
Yeah, within weeks they did it as well. So there's all these cities, there's all this drug policy reform related to psychedelics.
And I'm in LA. I'm really hoping it comes. I know Oakland and some other places in California are doing the same thing. So I'm really hoping it follows suit here sooner than later.
Yeah, there's decrim initiatives on the ballot for California. There's California is such a big state. Everything's so expensive to do in California, but I think it will come there. And so we're at this place, you could also say, in human consciousness where there's the world has gotten smaller, both through the internet, through technology, the fact we could have this conversation like this, live time with us seeing each other, images as well. So it's been harder and harder for different groups to say we're the one right religion and there's, no other right religions, or that, we're the dominant race, or, all these things. So we have cultures bumping up against each other. And at the same time, we're finally sort of going back to space with a lot of these space telescopes and things. So I think that global warming, also you could say the pandemic, also the internet, have helped us all realize how interconnected we all really are.
Right.
And the number of extinctions that are happening right now is just terrifying. So there's all these global phenomena that hopefully, on the one hand, people can retreat back into their own tribe, their own shell. And we see a lot of that, this increase in authoritarianism, fundamentalism, tribalism. But that's, I think, as a reaction to this sort of growing awareness that those kind of ways of thinking are not really sustainable in this interconnected world. And so there's, at the same time, this kind of retreat into this resistance. There's also an openness. There's an incredible report. This was from a human rights activist who had used MDMA assisted therapy to get over his trauma. But he was a Muslim. And he talked about how this deepened his understanding of Islam. But that it made him more religious, but in a spiritual, metaphorical way rather than in a literal way.
Dogmatic way.
Yeah. And so I think that's where humanity and consciousness is sort of struggling in this way to break out of the shell of these old tribal, narrow ways of thinking and to become more ecumenical. And that is the hope for psychedelics. That's the hope that 51 years ago got me to focus my life on psychedelics, that the political implications of feeling that we're all interconnected means we're not going to trash the environment so much. We're not going to realize, or we're not going to think mistakenly that we're separate from the environment. We're going to realize how interconnected we all are. I think that's really the fundamental consciousness shift that we need to make. And if we can make that as a species, we're likely not to just survive, but to really thrive. More art, music, poetry, lovemaking, spending our time um, in human pursuits and not just on the dire struggle for survival.
Yeah.
We'll be able to, if we can get equitable distribution of resources, there's enough for everybody.
Yeah.
We don't
Right.
need one person that has $250 billion and another person that lives on less than $1 a day.
It's pointless.
Yeah. So I think that's why I think your podcast and other podcasts, and it's so important. That's why it was so critical that we get on Fox News.
Yeah.
This story needs to be distributed more widely. The story of hope and optimism that a lot of people are, you read the newspaper and it looks grim, and it is grim in a lot of ways. But I think there's as many reasons for hope as there is for despair.
Yeah.
The fact that your father could move out of a dark space, I think humanity as a whole can, and now we've got death dealing Putin and Che and all, Xi. I mean, from China, and just incredible repressive systems.
Yeah.
That the technology of repression is getting so good
Yeah.
with facial recognition and all of this that we really need to lock in human rights
Yeah. Yeah.
before
100%.
it's too late.
It's interesting though, as you talk about, realizing sort of the oneness. People are realizing like, hey, we're one family. And that's really what plant medicines and psychedelics, I think one of the fundamental threads that crosses from all of them in my experience that I've taken and tried over the years has that common thread. It really helps to sink in. We are all connected. It is one consciousness. We are one family. And that is this, whether it's MDMA, whether it's MDA, whether it's
Yeah.
psilocybin or LSD or DMT, it all kind of points to this truth. So I think it's interesting and none too late that the stranglehold on psychedelics is loosening as it is imperative that we realize the oneness of mankind and all life on earth.
Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
because I think we have the brilliance of our mind and our technology that we can solve all of these resource problems. We can
Yeah.
arrange for everybody to get fed and everybody to have shelter, and we can develop renewable energy that doesn't cause so many problems as climate change. We can do that. Our minds are brilliant, but we don't have the emotional and spiritual maturity to handle the technology that we got. And so I
Right.
think it's a race between, well,
Like
as
a
I said in
dangerous
my
teenager with the car keys,
yeah,
right?
yeah, it's a race between consciousness and catastrophe.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Well put.
psychedelics are here to help consciousness prevail.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I'm curious if obviously having your finger on the pulse of so many cutting edge things in the space, is there any, you hear about sort of some of these research chemicals, 2CB is one in recent years that has gotten out
mhm.
there and more well known. And, is there any that maybe I or the listeners haven't heard about that you have sort of taken a look at that you're particularly optimistic or excited about?
Yeah, well, let me just comment a bit about 2CB. So 2CB was a creation of Sasha Shulgin. And he was also the one that really pioneered the rediscovery of MDMA and the move
Mm,
of MDMA into therapeutic circles in the late 70s. And then it escaped the therapeutic circles and began sold as a party drug as ecstasy. The people that were distributing ecstasy in the early 80s um, thought about 2CB as well. So MDMA was the nickname of MDMA was Adam, and then the underground name for 2CB was Eve.
aha,
And
interesting.
but 2CB is a little bit more psychedelic,
Hmm.
visual, a little bit more ego dissolution than um, MDMA.
Yeah.
So at the time, a bunch of us sort of spoke to the people that were in, behind ecstasy, and suggested that they do not try to mass market 2CB. That if they did that in the same way that they did with MDMA reduces fear, reduces activity in the amygdala, makes it easier for people to handle difficult emotions. 2CB is more activating, and we thought that there would be more, it's more challenging.
Yeah.
And we thought there would be a lot more negative effects if people were not unprepared. And also, 2CB is more powerful milligram per milligram than MDMA. So if you make a little bit of a mistake weighing MDMA, and instead of 125 milligrams, it's 115 milligrams or it's 130 milligrams, it doesn't really matter that much. But for 2CB, it's active in 10 milligrams or 15 milligrams. If you get 30 milligrams instead of 15 milligrams, it's a major different experience. Yeah. So in any case, but 2CB is a phenomenal drug. And I think people should be rightly excited about exploring all of its different potentials. The one drug that I would say that I just have been experimenting with more recently is the 5-MeO-DMT.
Yeah, I've done that.
I did do that back in 1985, back in the day when you smoked it in a pipe, and it was overwhelming experience. It's considered the most powerful of psychedelics, the most ego-dissolving. But what's developed in a kind of an unexpected way, I think myself and a bunch of other people would not have predicted it, but it's vape pens with varying doses of 5-MeO. And so you can take smaller amounts, the same way people talk about microdosing, Brendan, what you talked about as well. So in smaller amounts of 5-MeO-DMT through these vape pens, you can kind of go a little bit out, but not completely.
Not full dissolution. Right.
Although you can also go the full dissolution, but you go in stages.
Yeah.
And you can kind of see what kind of psychological issues you encounter at different stages. So I think the 5-MeO vape pens are a real technological advantage and a step forward. There have been some very notable advocates to talk about MDMA, and then an hour later, the 5-MeO vape pens. That you have this reassuring MDMA reduction of fear, and then you can kind of let go as your ego is dissolving, as you're sort of letting go of your normal way of orienting your inner experience. So I think there's a lot to be learned. Those are the things that should be explored more in the future. But the way we have to do this in above ground ways is one drug at a time through the FDA, and only then do you start making combinations. Yeah. So the underground therapy is a decade ahead or more of what's going on above ground.
Right.
And so we are trying, as I say, hopefully next summer to have MDMA approved by the FDA, then Israel, then Canada, then we'll try to work through Europe and globalize Brazil, Australia, and elsewhere. And I think that what we'll end up having then is a couple of years after that, psilocybin will be approved most likely for depression. And so I think the big need that we have, and I guess I'd like to make this point to your listeners, is that the drug is not the treatment, it's the therapy. And so we need 25,000 or more trained psychedelic therapists. So for any of the listeners that are really trying to think of how might they make a contribution to the psychedelic renaissance, I'd actually encourage people to think about whether they want to become trained therapists. Now, what you described with your dad, is something usually, we can help people that we care about. You provide a safe space, you provide support, you provide the knowledge, but often it is difficult for people who don't have a sort of psychological understanding to sit for people. So I think it's really, really good that you were able to do that with your dad, and that he trusted you, and you trusted yourself, and your mom trusted you. But I would say that for people to think about, going back to school, or if you are a therapist thinking about going through our training program or other training programs, that the biggest need to really mainstreaming psychedelics is the need for more therapists.
Yeah, I think that's I'm so glad that you brought that up because I'm sure there's listeners that are, instantly getting a big yes. What a cool thing to be able to do, to sit with someone and be trained to as this new avenue is just coming online. You talk, I remember being in high school or whatever. These are the new jobs that will exist in the future, and it's like
Yeah,
this is the new job that will exist. And for someone who's tuning into this broadcast, there's probably a lot of people who are the perfect fit of empathy, heart-centered, intelligent to do that job extremely effectively. So MAPS is currently offers coursework in this.
yeah. So the MAPS Public Benefit Corp is going to be training people um, in what they're calling educational experiences. And MAPS, the nonprofit, we're training people all over the world. So
Mm-hmm.
MAPS Public Benefit Corp is sort of taking on training in the U.S. for people that will be able to administer MDMA to PTSD patients, hopefully once legal access is obtained. But what we're doing is more humanitarian projects all over the world, MAPS, the nonprofit. So, for example, we've got a training taking place in Sarajevo in August for Ukrainian therapists, for
Wow.
therapists from Armenia, Ukraine, Bosnia, and
Wow.
potentially the Netherlands. And we're trying to go to where the trauma is, not
Yeah.
necessarily where the money is. And
Yep.
there's just 4 to 5 million Ukrainian refugees in Poland with PTSD.
Wow.
So we are trying to work in Africa. We're trying to work on a training program. We haven't scheduled it yet, but there's a lot. There's just so much trauma in the world. There's an estimated 350 million minimum people with PTSD in the
Wow.
world,
Wow.
and there's
Wow.
probably way more than that. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, MAPS itself is trying to globalize and do this in more of a humanitarian context, while the Benefit Corp is trying to um, move forward in the area that in the U.S. that if we make change in the U.S., that radiates all over the world. So that is
Right.
the critical work. And then MAPS itself is doing public education, like our conference. We're doing harm reduction. We're trying to prepare for a post-prohibition world. And
Mm-hmm.
what that means is that people should have the freedom to explore their consciousness without it being a crime.
Mm-hmm.
But there's going to be a lot of people that aren't prepared. They'll take doses that are higher than they thought, or they'll encounter experiences that are fearful. And so we want to be training people in peer support, in how to help your friends and yourself through these experiences when they get difficult. We like to say that difficult is not the same as bad.
Yeah. Right.
People think,
Right.
oh, this is a bad trip. It's difficult. Well, you learn awful lot from difficult experiences. And so
Yeah.
we're trying to
Right.
reframe it that once things get difficult, sometimes that's where you learn the most.
It's where the
Um,
breakthroughs come in a
yeah.
lot of times, right?
Yeah. And in fact, that's a good point. I want to say that the reason that we have a renaissance in psychedelics right now, in part, is because there's an enormous need for it.
Yeah.
Society as a whole is breaking down.
Yep. Right.
We just have more mental health illnesses than ever before. The pandemic increased it, and then it's just continuing
Yeah.
ever
Right.
since to increase. So there's more of a recognition of adolescent suicides, of adolescent depressions, of difficulties from emotional impacts on social media, all those things. So that we're at a crisis point in America. There was over 100,000 people last year died of opiate and fentanyl
Wow.
overdoses.
Wow.
It's just, so I think it's this crisis which is opening people's minds to how do we address this mental health crisis. So that's where difficult in this case um, is not the same as bad. It's stuff we need to pay attention to,
Yeah.
particularly things that we've been pushing away. Like, look at all the climate change denial. You don't see that anymore. When you have
Right.
all of these extreme weather events, but you don't see people saying, "Oh, I was wrong to pretend like there was no such thing happening." You don't
Right.
see that happening either.
Right.
But at
Right.
least the denial is pretty much wiped away in the face of ever more damaging
Right.
climate
Right.
events.
Right. We've had, as of this recording, some of the hottest temperatures ever recorded on the planet, right?
Yeah,
In
yeah,
recent weeks. So, whew, it's a interesting time to be alive. We are in the thick of it,
yeah,
that's for sure, right? And
yeah,
I think of it as like, why are there so many souls here at this time? So many people on the planet. Well, it's the big show. It's a big moment in our evolutionary journey, and um, uh, you know,
yeah, yeah. I
completely
guess
get
I
right.
would like to encourage people. There's something else that everybody can do that people are listening to, and
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't cost any money at all,
Mm-hmm.
but it's to come out, the psychedelic coming out, the same way we've seen that with gay rights and gay activists that led to gay marriage. Of course, there's
Mm-hmm.
backlash in different places, but we need a psychedelic coming out.
Mm.
Um, People would be shocked if they knew who had their life positively or even negatively impacted by psychedelics.
Yeah.
People are quiet about it.
Yep.
So so everybody, I think the way that you've come out to your mother and father, which is phenomenal, but I think other people need to think about their family members and others so that all of
Yep.
us can sort of spread our direct experience to others, and especially where it contradicts sort of
Gives them
the
permission.
propaganda.
If they can see that your life, I always say results speak the loudest. I can have all kinds of
Yeah,
ideas. What results has it gotten me? Certainly my life is not perfect, but it's pretty beautiful. There's a lot of beauty around me. There's so much good. And it's like I attribute a lot of that to being open to these things. And I think it's hard to deny if someone like my parents, even, it's like, oh, he's not, his brain doesn't, he doesn't speak as if his brain is like in a frying pan, like Nancy Reagan told me, because he did this plant that grows this medicine that grows out of the ground. And in like my dad's case, he's continued on with microdosing, and to great benefit. Is definitely has made a difference. And so it's, how many people could be helped that that haven't been. And if those of us who are on the leading edge of this would speak up, more people will have the opportunity to
yeah.
find their way.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll just say is that MAPS is a nonprofit organization, and so we'd encourage people to go to the MAPS website if they want and donate, become a MAPS member. That's what will give us more capacity to do more things.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot, but also just get educated yourself.
Yeah.
This podcast and other things, and then share what you learn. That's
Yeah.
what everybody can do. That doesn't cost any money at all.
Absolutely. Well, as we wind down here, Rick, I would love to. One of the go-to questions that I have for my guest is, I love story time. I love hearing
Mm,
stories of synchronicity or serendipity or a positive paranormal story, or maybe an incredible, story
mm.
around plant medicines or psychedelics that you're aware of. So curious if you have something fun and inspiring up your sleeve to share.
Yeah. Okay. So this is interesting. So I just was with Stanley Krippner, who's in his 90s. He was an early psychedelic researcher, but also very interested in the paranormal, as you
Mm-hmm.
say. And he did some studies in dream telepathy,
Mm-hmm.
where they would have people in the Maimonides Dream Lab in New York, and they would have outside people try to send them some sort of image and see if it showed up in their dreams and different things. So I'll just share the most ESP like experience of my whole life
Mm-hmm.
was back in 1985, and I was at a party doing MDMA. I had no relationship. I was alone at this time. Um, and I was with some friends that were married, and a bunch of people were, romantically involved with each other at this party. And so, sort of in the middle of the night, I just sort of went off by myself, and I started having these memories of women that I'd been lovers with. And I was sort of updating the relationship in my
Mm-hmm.
mind. I would think about it. I would, so it didn't feel like it was just reviewing a memory. It felt like everything was alive and fresh. And I was kind
Mm-hmm.
of processing. And I did this with 4 or 5 different people that I had been in relationship with.
Mm-hmm.
And then at one point, I had this feeling, this woman's body inside my own body. It was like,
Wow.
it wasn't, you could say that it's your in Jungian terms, it's your animus, it's or your and it's your female side,
Uh-huh.
but it
Mhm.
didn't feel like that. It didn't feel like my female side or so. It felt like some other presence.
Wow.
And this was like around 4 in the morning or something. All right. So 6 in the morning comes, go to bed, go to the hotel room, and there's a message for me. Somebody had called in the middle of the night, and it was this person, Chris, and I didn't know, is this a man, is this a woman, whatever. I didn't didn't know who this was. But it was too early to call, so I went to sleep. And then later I called this person, and it turns out that it was a woman, Chris, who I'd been lovers with, but she had left town more than a year before, and we had not been in touch at all. And she shared that the reason she called is that she had a dream that was so strong that the dream was of me, and she had the feeling she had to call me right then.
Wow.
And she called my house in Florida, and I wasn't there, and they told her I was at this hotel in New York, and so she called there and left this message. Turned out she was like an hour away, outside of New York. Now, she was at a crisis point where she was doing opiates too much and was starting to think that she was getting dependent on opiates, and she
Mm-hmm.
was worried about falling in love with her boyfriend's best friend and not so much her boyfriend,
Oh, wow.
and so she was at this kind of crisis point, and I was at this sort of lonely point, and and so what we realized is maybe that she had this dream of me at the exact moments that I had this woman's body inside my body.
Wow.
So I was in an MDMA state. She was in a dream state. Maybe there was this way. We decided that we would get together. A couple of days later, we did get together and we did MDMA. And then this is where it came out that she was in this crisis place, and that I talked about my loneliness, and so maybe that is the most provocative experience of my whole life that makes me think that we do have other ways to get information than just our normal five senses.
Absolutely. Wow. It's really a interesting share there for me, because last week I had a dream state experience unlike anything I've ever had. It was
Huh.
incredible. I'll just share because it's so fresh
Yeah.
and somewhat relevant. So no psychedelics were involved, but in the dream state, I dreamed that I was connecting with my deceased grandmother and grandfather, uh,
Wow. Wow.
who one died in the 80s and one in the 90s. And my grandfather was Joe, and my grandmother we called Moo. And in the dream, it was like I was excited. I had them on the line, like, oh, I've connected, I've got them, kind of like this, seeing and hearing them.
Mm.
And we spoke, and I don't remember all that was said, but I woke up from the dream, and all I remembered was my grandfather, who was at Pearl Harbor in World War II when it got bombed. He was on the
Wow.
Utah, which is still sunk in the harbor, and his friend standing next to him did not survive when they got hit by the Japanese. He
Huh.
jumped and swam and survived, luckily for me. And
Wow.
so in the dream, I woke up thinking my grandfather Joe's friend is coming through. His name is Peter Finch, and I need to remember this in the morning. So I half asleep write the note Peter Finch, World War II on my phone, and go back to sleep instantly. I don't remember it in the morning. I go to grab my phone. I'm like, oh yeah, this note's up. Peter Finch. Who is this? Real? Is this a real name? And I go and Google it. First thing that comes up is a famous actor who died in the 70s. He was the first Australian actor who he died and then won an Oscar a few months after his death for a movie called The Network. I wasn't familiar with him, but I was shocked to see this is a real person. And not only is Wikipedia all about his acting, but then the next thing is he was in a well-known battle in World War II as a gunner. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a real guy. And and he was in World War II. That's a big part of his Wikipedia. So keep in mind, I instantly, Rick, think of my son, because my son is 24. When he was 18, my psychic medium friend's like, oh my gosh, your son's going to be this huge actor. Charlie Chaplin's a spirit guide. And she gave all this huge reading to him. He wasn't an actor at the time, but since he's now he just won Best Actor in an Independent Short Film in the LA Film Awards. He's really on a path
Wow.
of success. So I instantly think of Bradley, like, oh my gosh, like this, maybe we need to watch Peter Finch's movie together. I don't know what this meant. A few hours later, Rick, I'm about to go out to play tennis. I have all my gear. My friend's on the way to the court. My son texts me, hey, Dad, I just got a left out of left field audition request. I got to submit a self-tape within 2 hours. It's about to be cut off for a World War II film. Will you help me? By reading opposite characters.
Yeah.
I'm like, had it not been for the dream, I would have never done
Wow.
this, because my friend was already on the way to the court. I canceled my plans. I'm reading, I'm doing lines opposite him, real short notice.
Yeah.
And then in it, his character's from Nebraska. And I'm like, oh, well, how about since you're from Nebraska, I'll just call you Moo. And I'm like, that's my grandmother that was in the dream, And so he submits it last week. A day later, hears back from them. They love him. They cast him this weekend. He filmed this short for this new World War II. It would be a show where they do a different Medal of Honor winner story in every episode.
Wow.
And it's, some pretty big people involved that were involved with Private Ryan and all these. And I'm like, because of this dream state experience, it led to this real information coming through. And I just thought,
that's amazing.
Isn't that fun? Like,
It's like, Brandon, that's great.
yeah, really, there's a lot more going on than most of us realize, and certainly plant medicines help us get to peer behind the veil. And I just applaud the work that you've done and are doing. Really, what a legacy, my friend. This is, and I know everyone listening has appreciated hearing all about it firsthand from you. What is the best way for people to stay in contact and connect and all this?
Well, the best way is to become a member of MAPS, or just sign up for our our newsletter, which is free if you want. And ask MAPS at maps.org if people have any questions. Just ask MAPS at maps.org, and we have people responding to them.
Cool.
Or just check out the website now and then.
Yep. Excellent. Well, I do have one final question for you here, and it is my cliche closer. In 60 seconds or less, what is the meaning of life according to Rick Doblin?
The meaning is what we make of it. The meaning of life is that we have an incredible opportunity. We're tiny, insignificant particles of an enormous, vast universe. It's easy to think that it's insignificant or that there is no meaning. The earth is going to be destroyed. The sun is going to go out. The earth is going to be destroyed. So I think the meaning is what we make of it. So love, kindness, simple human kindness, I'd say, is the essence of the meaning of life. Just trying to celebrate every moment and be nice to people around you, and try to bring in more love. And it's at the same time, what we experience in some ways lasts forever, even though it's transitory and we're here and gone. I think there's some record perhaps, but even if there isn't, the meaning is in the now, and making the now as loving, as beautiful as possible.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah. Gandhi said, if you want to find yourself, lose yourself in the service of others. And I believe that holds true, because there are no others. And you've certainly found your path to do that. And I'm excited to hear from listeners. I just have that intuitive feeling. There's a lot of people jumping up and down. You mean I could be a psychedelic assisted therapist? Where do I go? So that'll be beautiful to hopefully this conversation leads to some of that. And thank all of you for tuning your beautiful brainwaves and incredible hearts into another episode. Until next time, journey well. I love you so